To get answers as to what happened on 9/11 in New York City, one area you should be looking at is memorial pins. Here we see a pin that really solves what happened on 9/11. It shows a ribbon wrapped around the Twin Towers. And exactly what happened on 9/11 was a ribbon worm transformation. Here we see a picture of a ribbon worm, and ribbon worms are also called proboscis worms, and they're the longest animal in the world. What you're looking at now is the all-seeing eye, and when you compare that to the proboscis of a ribbon worm, it's a direct match. 911 is the number you dial when there's an emergency. And when an emergency happens, usually an ambulance will show up. And on the ambulance is the rod of Asclepius. It's also called the Star of Life. And essentially, it's a worm wrapped around a rod. The rod of Asclepius is the symbol for medicine. And here is the flag of the World Health Organization. And you'll see the rod of Asclepius right in the center of the flag. Here is the anatomy of a ribbon worm. And when you're looking at the proboscis of the ribbon worm, it looks very much like the rod of Asclepius. Another place where you could find the rod of Asclepius is on the back of a limpet snail. Here is a limpet snail, and there is the rod of Asclepius. It's as if the ribbon worm lives inside of the snail. And here's a picture of a limpet snail with the shell and the mantle appearing to be in the shape of a pancake. It's important to point out that on 9/11, the Twin Towers collapsed, and a lot of the building experts said that it collapsed because it experienced a pancake collapse. Here we see a photograph of a limpet, and on its back, coming up through the mantle, is a siphon. And when you research the word siphon, siphon is a tube. I just want to read a quick passage from Wikipedia as to how the Twin Towers were constructed. It says the towers were designed as framed tube structures. I guess what I'm proposing is that in the center of both Twin Towers, a giant long siphon ran up and down the center of the towers. And this siphon is the proboscis of a ribbon worm. So on 9/11, these siphons that ran up and down the center of the towers burst open and destroyed the towers, and new life burst out of the siphons. It really was a Phoenix type event that occurred in New York City. Another very interesting fact is that the Twin Towers were built on bedrock. And the word limpet means lamb rock. So the Twin Towers were actually built on giant snails, 2 giant snails, because the siphons ran up and down the center of the Twin Towers. And we're going to take a look at the old logo for the Twin Towers here. Here we see the logo of the Twin Towers. This logo was used in the 1980s, and it shows a yin and yang type symbol with the towers rising on top of the yin and yang. Let's compare the yin and yang symbol to banana slugs. Here's a picture of banana slugs mating, and that's the yin and yang symbol. And banana slugs are snails. So you look at the logo for the Twin Towers, and it's 2 snails mating at Bedrock. In 1961 to 1962, the powers that run New York and New Jersey decided the towers, the World Trade Center, would be built right on the western part of Lower Manhattan. And at that time, in 1961, there was a movie that came out called Mothra. And Mothra is the playbook of 9/11. In the movie, a giant worm climbs up a tower, destroys the tower, and transforms into Mothra. And that's what happened on 9/11. At this point, you might be saying, well, I remember watching television on 9/11, and I don't remember seeing any giant bat moth creatures breaking out of the Twin Towers. How come I didn't see the Phoenix-type event that you're describing? And the reason is video fakery. What was showing on televisions across the world was a pre-recorded movie. If you want to learn more about how video fakery was used on 9/11, there's an excellent video that's been out for many years called September Clues. And in the video, the author lays out a clear case that the world watched a movie on television on 9/11. It's also important to note that researchers studying video fakery and putting out videos about video fakery on 9/11 may not subscribe to the bat moth creatures. If you do your own research, you could put the pieces of the puzzle together of what actually happened that day. While the fake movie played on television on 9/11, military-grade smoke machines would have been used to cover all views of Lower Manhattan. And that's how you tell a real picture, a real photograph of what happened that day. All you're going to see is thick clouds of smoke. The horrific loss of life on 9/11 and the destruction of the Twin Towers was a tragedy. And when you look up the word tragedy, it means goat song. There are a lot of key words in the English language that have to do with goats and are related to goats. And there's a lot of interesting mythology about goats. And what's important about this is that on 9/11, the President of the United States was listening to a story about goats. It was called The Pet Goat. So we have the tragedy going on in New York City, and tragedy is a goat song. And at the same time, we have the President listening to a story about a goat. Is it possible that ribbon worms hold the secret to this goat song mystery? Here is a photograph of the anatomy of a ribbon worm. And underneath one of the cerebral ganglions, you could clearly see the spiritual image of a goat. And this is the goat of 9/11. The story of the pet goat is from a book called Reading Mastery 2, Storybook 1. And that's the book that George Bush is holding in his hand on 9/11. And the cover of the book tells the story of 9/11. In the center of the picture, we see an elf holding an open chest. And out of that chest, butterflies are flying all about. And that really is what happened inside the Twin Towers. The Twin Towers burst open, and giant bat moths or goat moths flew out of the towers. The Twin Towers were a giant 11 in the New York skyline. And when you look up 11 in an etymology dictionary, like Etym Online, you get the word elf. So the elf is representing the Twin Towers, and he holds an open chest. And chest is a trunk, and trunk is a proboscis. And remember, we're talking about proboscis worms. And out of the proboscis worms were the creatures that flew out of the towers that day. If you would like to learn more about ribbon worms and 9/11, I have a book out called The Towers of Transformation, and that's available on Amazon.